My stepfather's will was read. I was the only one in that room who wasn't surprised. I sat with my hands folded in my lap, watching my stepbrother across the long oak table at the lawyer's office in Oakville. He had driven 3 hours from Ottawa for this. He was wearing a suit I'd never seen before, and his wife kept smoothing her skirt like she was getting ready for a job interview. My stepmother, his mother, sat at the head of the table with her hands wrapped around a paper coffee cup, not drinking it, just holding it like it steadied her. I counted the tiles on the ceiling. 42. I've been doing that a lot lately, counting things. My name is Jade. I'm 31 years old and I work as a forensic accountant at a mid-sized firm in Hamilton. I find things people try to hide in numbers. That's my job. I'm good at it. I wish I had been using those skills sooner on the people sitting in that room with me. My dad, Gordon, died 11 months before that meeting. Pancreatic cancer. It moved fast, 3 months from diagnosis to the end. He spent the last 6 weeks in the hospital on Fanshawe Park Road in London, Ontario, and I drove out every weekend without missing one. My stepmother, Lydia, was there too, most of the time. We were never close, but we were civil. I told myself that was enough. Dad had been married to Lydia for 14 years. She came into my life when I was 16, old enough to be skeptical, too young to fully understand what was happening. She had a son from her first marriage, my stepbrother Kevin, who was 2 years older than me. Kevin was the type of person who shook your hand too long and laughed at his own jokes before finishing them. He sold commercial real estate in Ottawa and talked about it constantly. Dad was a quiet man, a structural engineer who built bridges for the province of Ontario for 27 years. He didn't talk much about money, but he was careful with it. He owned our family home outright, a 4-bedroom place in Burlington on the Niagara Escarpment with a view that made people stop on the sidewalk. He had a registered retirement fund, a modest investment portfolio, and a life insurance policy. He also had a trust he had set up for me when I turned 18, funded from my mother's estate after she died in a car accident when I was 9. That trust had grown over the years. It was mine, legally and entirely, and had nothing to do with anyone else in that room. That should have been simple. It wasn't. 3 weeks after Dad's funeral, Lydia called me. I was at my apartment in Hamilton eating leftover butter chicken and watching something forgettable on Netflix. She wanted to discuss finances. I told her I was happy to do that. She said she thought we should meet with her financial advisor, a man named Gareth, who I had never heard of, to get everything sorted. I said I would think about it. I did think about it. And I thought about it again when she called a second time and said Gareth thought it would be wise if I gave her temporary signing authority over the trust while the estate was being settled, to keep things moving. I told her the trust was already settled. It had nothing to do with Dad's estate. She said she understood that, but it would just be easier, for everyone. I said no, politely. She called a third time. That time Kevin was on the call too. He told me I was being difficult. He used the word difficult 3 times in 4 minutes. His wife said something in the background I couldn't quite hear. I told them both I wasn't going to discuss my trust, thanked them for calling, and ended the conversation. That was when I started paying attention. I had power of attorney for my father's health decisions in those final months, and I had been the one coordinating with the hospital and his palliative team. What I had not been paying attention to was what was happening with his accounts at the same time. I trusted Lydia to handle that. She had been his wife for 14 years. I thought that was reasonable. What I found, when I finally started looking, was not reasonable at all. Dad's investment account had a right of survivorship clause, which meant it transferred to Lydia automatically on his death. That was legal and expected, but there were also 3 withdrawals from that account in the 8 weeks before he died. Weeks when he was in the hospital, sedated for pain management, not exactly reviewing his statements. The amounts were not small. Altogether, they totaled just over $68,000, moved in pieces to an account I didn't recognize. I sat at my kitchen table one Wednesday night in February, with his bank records spread across the screen of my laptop, and I felt the particular cold feeling that I get when I find something in numbers that doesn't belong. It's not anger, not at first. It's more like recognition, like your brain already knew and was waiting for the rest of you to catch up. I didn't call Lydia. I didn't call Kevin. I went to work the next morning and asked a colleague I trust to do an informal second look at what I was seeing. She confirmed what I had found. Then she said, quietly, "Jade, is this your family?" I said yes. She said, "You know what you need to do." I did. But I wasn't ready yet. Because I had also found something else. The insurance policy, the life insurance Dad had carried for 20 years, had a named beneficiary. Me. He had never changed it. Not when he married Lydia, not ever. It was a policy worth $340,000. And 3 weeks after Dad died, Lydia had filed a claim on it. Not as a beneficiary, as the representative of the estate, arguing that the policy proceeds should be treated as estate assets rather than going directly to the named beneficiary. In other words, arguing that the $340,000 should go through the estate, which she controlled, rather than to me. She had hired a lawyer to make that argument, a real estate lawyer named Philip Brask, who had done some conveyancing work for Kevin in Ottawa, and who, it turned out, had also been the one to recommend Gareth, the financial advisor who wanted signing authority over my trust. I want to be clear about what I felt in that moment. Not panic. Not even anger, exactly. It was closer to grief. The specific kind you feel when someone reveals themselves to be exactly the thing you were afraid they were, and you realize there was no version of this where you were wrong to be afraid. I gave myself 1 week to feel that. Then I built my file. I am a forensic accountant. I do this for corporations, for insurers, for the CRA when they need someone who can read a ledger like a story. I spent 6 weeks after that building the most thorough documentation I have ever assembled in my career, and I was doing it about my own family. I requested every statement Dad had authorized me to access under POA. I subpoenaed, through a civil attorney I retained, a woman named Margaret who works out of a small firm in downtown Hamilton, and who I trusted immediately because she asked hard questions and did not try to reassure me, the transfer records for the unrecognized account. I traced the $68,000 to an account held jointly by Lydia and Kevin. Not just Lydia. Kevin, too. He had been driving those 3 hours from Ottawa more regularly than I knew. Not to visit his mother. To meet with Gareth. To move money. I kept going to work. I kept driving to Burlington to pick up the mail at the family home, which Lydia was still living in, and I kept being polite when I ran into her. I brought her a coffee once from the Tim Hortons on New Street. She said thank you. I said you're welcome. I drove home and sat in my car in the parking garage for 20 minutes before I could get out. The insurance dispute came to a hearing before the Ontario Superior Court in April. Lydia's lawyer, Philip Brask, had filed a motion arguing the policy should be treated as an estate asset, on the grounds that the beneficiary designation was out of date and inconsistent with the deceased's clear intentions. He submitted a letter in support of this claim. The letter was purportedly signed by a financial planner named Derek Callan, who claimed to have met with my father in the months before his death and to have discussed and documented his wishes to revise the beneficiary designation. I had never heard of Derek Callan. My father had not mentioned him. The hospital records I had subpoenaed showed that during the period Derek Callan claimed to have met with my father had been admitted to hospital and was receiving IV pain medication. He had 2 documented good days in that stretch. Neither of them was the date listed on Callan's letter. I brought this to Margaret. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "We need an expert to look at that letter." We got one. A forensic document examiner from Toronto who had testified in over 60 cases in Ontario courts. She examined the letter and found 3 things. The signature was inconsistent with Dad's documented signature on hospital intake forms from the same week. The date on the document used a formatting standard inconsistent with Canadian financial planning records of that period. And the letterhead contained a postal code that did not match the address listed. The letter was fabricated. I did not fall apart when I got that report. I printed it. I put it in the folder. I made a cup of tea and called my aunt in Guelph, my dad's sister, the only person in the family I had told any of this to. And I said, "I think we're ready." She said, "Your father would be proud of you." I didn't say anything back for a moment. I looked out my kitchen window at the street below, at the ordinary Wednesday happening outside, and I thought about my dad building bridges, the care he took, the idea that something you build has to hold weight, has to be tested, has to be real before you let people walk across it. I thought, I built something real. Now let's see if it holds. The hearing was on a Tuesday morning in May, at the courthouse on Main Street West in Hamilton. I wore a gray blazer and flat shoes, and I arrived 20 minutes early. Lydia came in with Kevin and his wife. Kevin was wearing the same suit as the will reading. His wife had a tote bag from a yoga studio. Lydia didn't look at me when she walked past. Philip Brask made his argument first. He was confident. He said the beneficiary designation was clearly the product of oversight, that my father had expressed his wishes verbally to multiple parties, that the letter from Derek Callan demonstrated documented intent to change the designation. He had a second letter from a neighbor of my father's, who claimed Dad had said I was estranged, and that he had intended to update his affairs. I was not estranged. I drove to London every weekend for 6 weeks to hold my father's hand. There are 47 timestamp photos on my phone from those visits, and a nurse's note in his file that reads, "Daughter present again today." When it was our turn, Margaret stood up and she was calm in the way that very precise people are calm, not because nothing is at stake, but because they have prepared for every contingency. She walked through the bank withdrawals. She walked through the joint account. She presented the forensic document examiner's report on the Callan letter. She asked that Derek Callan be directed to appear before the court to verify his signature. Brask objected. The judge, a woman in her early 60s with short gray hair and reading glasses, she kept sitting down on the bench and picking back up, looked at him over those glasses and said, "On what grounds?" He said the request was disruptive and unnecessary. She said, "I've read the report, Mr. Brask. The request seems quite necessary." Callan was not in the room. He had not been expected to be there, because no one had anticipated that his letter would be challenged with a forensic examination. An adjournment was called. Margaret leaned over to me and said, quietly, "Good." When proceedings resumed, Callan appeared by video. He was older than I expected, somewhere in his late 60s, and he looked uncomfortable in a way that had nothing to do with the camera angle. The judge asked him to confirm under oath that he had met with my father on the date specified in the letter and that the signature on the document was genuine. There was a pause that lasted several seconds. He said he had met with my father, yes. The judge asked him to confirm the date. Another pause. He said he would need to check his records. The judge set her glasses down on the bench. She looked at him through the screen. She said, "Mr. Callan, you are currently under oath. I would encourage you to consider your answer carefully." Kevin, in my peripheral vision, shifted in his seat. His wife stopped moving entirely. Lydia was looking at the floor. Callan said that he may have been mistaken about the specific date. Margaret asked him to confirm whether he had ever met my father in person. He said he had spoken to him. She asked, "In person?" A longer pause. He said, "By phone." She asked, "And the signature on the letter, was that signature witnessed by Callan himself?" He said he had been sent the document to attach his letterhead to. He said he understood it had been signed separately. He said he had been told it was a formality. The room was very quiet after that, the kind of quiet that isn't comfortable. The judge asked Brask if he would like a recess. He said yes. The recess lasted 12 minutes. When Brask came back, he requested permission to withdraw the letter from evidence. The judge said the letter was already in evidence and that its provenance was now a matter of record. She said she would be referring the matter to the Law Society of Ontario regarding the circumstances of its submission. She looked at Lydia then. Not at Brask. Not at Callan on the screen. At Lydia. She said, "Mrs. Harlow, do you have anything you would like to say at this time?" Lydia looked at her lawyer. Brask shook his head very slightly. Lydia said nothing. The insurance proceeds were awarded to me in full, with costs. The court also ordered a forensic audit of the estate accounts, given the bank withdrawal evidence Margaret had presented. Lydia's contested claim was dismissed. On the way out of the courthouse, Kevin said my name. I turned around. He looked like he hadn't slept in several days, which was probably true. He started to say something and then stopped. His wife was looking at the floor. I waited. He said, "I didn't think it would go this far." I looked at him for a moment. I thought about the 3 drives from Ottawa, the joint account, the $68,000 in pieces. I said, "I know." I turned and walked out into the May sun on Main Street West, and I called my aunt from the parking lot and I cried for about 4 minutes. The kind of crying that isn't sad exactly. More like the release of something you've been carrying for a long time in your shoulders without realizing it. The forensic audit took another 4 months. It found in total $91,400 moved from my father's accounts in the final weeks of his life and the period immediately following his death. The audit also found that Gareth, the financial advisor who had called to ask for signing authority over my trust, had received a referral fee from Kevin for bringing in the Callan letter contact. His registration with the Financial Services Regulatory Authority of Ontario was suspended pending review. Derek Callan surrendered his financial planning designation voluntarily before a disciplinary hearing could be convened. The Law Society investigation into Philip Rask's conduct is still ongoing, as of the last letter Margaret received. The estate was ultimately settled 8 months after that court date. The family home in Burlington, the one with the view that made people stop on the sidewalk, was sold. Lydia received her share under the terms of the will, which my father had signed with a different lawyer, 2 years before he died, in sound mind and without ambiguity. I received my share. I did not contest her portion. My father had chosen to provide for her, and that had been his choice to make, and I respected it. What I contested was what was taken without choice, without consent, in the quiet of those final weeks when my father was sleeping and in pain, and trusting the people around him to be decent. I still drive through Burlington sometimes on my way to visit my aunt in Guelph. I don't go past the house anymore. But I drive past the escarpment, and I think about my dad and his bridges, and how a good structure doesn't collapse under pressure. It just shows you what it's made of. Some things hold, some things don't. I'm glad I know the difference now. I still think about the drive home from that courthouse on Main Street West. Not the verdict, not the number, not even Lydia's face when the judge said what she said. I think about the parking lot, sitting in my car with the phone in my hand, calling my aunt, and not being able to speak for the first few seconds because something in my chest had finally let go of something it had been gripping for almost a year. That's what nobody tells you about doing the right thing the hard way. It doesn't feel triumphant in the moment. It mostly just feels like exhaustion leaving your body. I've thought a lot about what made the difference, not just legally, but in terms of who I was able to be through all of it. And I keep coming back to 3 things that had nothing to do with luck. The first was integrity. Not the word on a poster, but the actual daily choice of it. When Lydia first called asking for signing authority over my trust, I could have argued, accused, made it loud. I didn't, because I knew that if I was going to challenge what she was doing, I had to do it cleanly. Every decision I made from that point forward had to be one I could defend in daylight. That meant no shortcuts, no retaliation, no meeting dishonesty with dishonesty. It's harder than it sounds when someone is stealing from your father's estate while he's still breathing. But it was the only way I could live with myself, and it turned out to be the only approach that actually worked. The second was clear thinking. I'm a forensic accountant. I find things in numbers, but the skill that mattered most wasn't technical. It was the ability to slow down and see what was actually in front of me instead of what I was afraid of or what I was hoping wasn't true. When I found those withdrawals, my instinct was to call Kevin immediately, to confront, to demand. I sat with it instead. I got a second opinion. I built the file. Clear thinking meant treating the situation like a case, not a wound, even when it was both. The third was staying power. 6 weeks of driving to London. 6 months of building documentation while being polite over coffee. Wading through adjournments and subpoenas and a forensic document examination while continuing to go to work every Monday morning and do my job. No one was coming to rescue this. I had to be the person who saw it through, day after day, without any guarantee it would end the way it did. Derek Callan surrendered his designation. Garrett's registration was suspended. The letter was struck from the record. These things happened not because the universe balanced some ledger on its own, but because someone paid attention, kept going, and refused to become the version of herself that the situation was trying to create. My dad built bridges for 27 years. He always said the most important part of the work wasn't the design, it was the testing. You had to know what it was made of before you let anyone walk across it. I know what I'm made of now. That part, at least, I got to keep.